Currently, the majority of public school students in this country are tracked according to their abilities. However, decades of educational research has shown that, in fact, non-tracked settings, also known as heterogeneous, provide the most effective learning environments for all students. Simply detracking students does not ensure quality teaching and learning. Successful heterogeneous instruction minimizes the teacher-centered classroom and maximizes student choice and individualized student pace with high expectations for all. This video will show many effective techniques you will need for your success in the heterogeneous classroom. Hello, my name is Kathryn Barwin, and I'm going to share with you successful strategies that can be used in all heterogeneous classes. I've taught reading, writing, and English classes at the middle level for the past 14 years. In 1984, when my principal decided to move our school from a tracked setting to an untracked setting in 1 year, I suffered great consternation. I knew that heterogeneous settings were supposed to be better for kids, but I couldn't imagine how I was going to meet the needs of all skill levels of readers and writers in one setting. Initially, I made some mistakes. I taught to the middle level, everyone read one text, I eliminated the skill level instruction that I had previously taught, and all kids were moved along at the same pace. It didn't work for the students or me, the teacher. I had to make changes in my methods, or I would have quickly lost my enthusiasm for teaching. Over the course of several years, I devised methods that truly do work, and I can honestly say that I would never go back to teaching in a tracked setting again. The benefits of successful heterogeneous instruction are enormous, both for teachers as well as students. I love my job. I have teachers visiting from other schools. Kids are excited and motivated. The gifted students are challenged and the low-level students are progressing. And parents are very happy with the quality of learning that takes place each day in our school.
It takes a tremendous amount of preparation to prepare materials for a class that has a variety of levels in it. And it takes a tremendous amount of facilitation during that period to meet the needs of those kids. And it's a very different model than a person who tends to be teacher-centered 40 minutes each period, expecting to impart that knowledge to a group of 25 youngsters. It doesn't work that way. One of the best benefits is that kids aren't typecast as being in the skills group, or they might call it the dummy group, all year long in all subjects. But I feel that one benefit is that kids have a chance to show what they know, even if they cannot read as well as someone else. Talking about a reading setting or in a social studies setting, it's fair to say that if we are detracked, there are kids of many different abilities, both in reading and writing, within that setting. If the instruction is appropriate, if there are opportunities for them to succeed and to discuss things with people who have a higher reading ability, then they can really shine. What I've seen in the classes that I've observed is that you have children who are known to be poor readers, or who are known to be poor writers, or who have low math ability, who in a group with students of mixed abilities, or within a class context, are responding to a set of questions based on higher ordered thinking skills, where they're analyzing information they've received through their reading, or just comparing and contrasting. They can stick with anybody as far as being able to interpret what they've read. Kids who are bright, who are good readers, or who are good writers, are hearing responses to questions from students who, in a track setting, would be considered the dummies. But in a setting where they're being treated as equals, as far as what they know intellectually, they are responding in wonderful ways. And their information is being valued by the higher ability children. I think that's one of the best things that the higher ability children gain, is that they have an opportunity to work with other children who aren't as bright, possibly. And while working with these young adults, they also realize they have something to offer. And I don't think they always realize that, particularly if they came from a track setting.
Successful heterogeneous teaching means that you will probably need to change your way of doing things in your classroom. Change is difficult, but believe me, it's worth it. If you teach to one level, usually the middle level, in a mixed ability classroom, you will not meet the needs of all your students. This video will show you lots of ways to be successful teaching to all levels in your heterogeneous classroom, and you can easily adapt any of these ideas to your own particular subject and teaching style. In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you a number of methods that I find to be successful in the heterogeneous setting. How to web for unit design, how to develop a multifaceted grading system that is fair to all levels of learners, how to set up flexible groups of students for instruction and student classwork, how to manage these groups easily, and finally, how to incorporate study skills easily into your content. I have a helpful hint for you. Plan by overall unit rather than sections in a book, because knowledge and learning does not happen in chapters. The first part of webbing for unit design involves taking a look at your content. You should articulate what it is your content is about, and do so in broad brushstrokes. Try to identify the understanding that students will gain by the unit's end. In many cases, this is similar to identifying a goal for your unit. By identifying the broad content goals, you're serving two purposes. Number one, it helps the teacher figure out what it is that they're doing with this unit. Why is it important? And secondly, it's important to share this information with the students themselves. I don't know how often you've gotten, I certainly have, the question, why do we have to do this unit? What are we supposed to get out of this unit? Why is it important? And already at the outset of the unit, you're identifying the reason that you're teaching this unit to the kids, and you're answering those questions already at the beginning. The second thing that you should work on is a combination of evaluation and activities. This entails specific activities that students are going to engage in that will demonstrate specifically that they understand the content. There should be a representative sampling of no choice, some choice, and free choice opportunities in this selection. These will be tied directly into the way students will be evaluated. The no choice and some choice activities tap into Howard Gardner's 7 types of intelligences, as well as they should be a mixture of concrete, transitional, and abstract activities. Once you've determined the activities that students will engage in, the third thing that you will identify are the skills that students will be working on. Once you've devised the outcomes-based activities that students are going to engage in, then you need to break these activities down into their composite skills. Do this for each separate activity. If you find that you've overlooked a particular skill that you want to include, go back and structure a meaningful activity in context that you can use as a vehicle for teaching the skill. Pay very close attention to these skills. You will need to pre-teach these skills to students who need them. Not all students are going to have all of these skills, so you'll want to identify them and make sure that everybody can do all of the skills involved in the unit. In this section, what you need to do is list the resources that you will be providing to students. If students are expected to read text, be sure to provide multi-level reading text on the topic. Include any videos or software or speakers that you have on the topic. First, this serves as a check for yourself to make sure you've allowed for differences in reading abilities, and secondly, this serves as a bibliography of sorts for your students now and for yourself later. In any unit, it's important to try to include printed text, since you want students to develop their reading abilities. Tape recordings are fine as a supplemental piece, but you want to include material that even your lowest level students can read in order to help them develop their reading skills. Finally, but perhaps most importantly, are the provocative or focused questions. As a teacher and the facilitator and mastermind of the unit, you will want to allow for some guidance in the material covered. However, it is very important to allow students input on the direction that they want to go when exploring this content. 1 or 2 broad questions from you and then an additional 3 or 4 questions from the class will help focus your unit. These are questions that should be discussed in a predictive fashion at the start of the unit and then used as wrap-up questions at the end. You might also want to use these questions as pre- and post-testing in order to get a very clear picture of what it is students have learned and understood from the unit. To show you how webbing works in a real situation, I'm going to walk you through a unit that we do with our 7th and 8th graders at the beginning of the year entitled Goal Setting, Getting What You Want. This is a thematic unit that is designed to help students realize that they can set goals for themselves and achieve those goals. The first part of the unit is content goals, and what we had to do is all of the teachers involved in the unit had to sit down and agree on 5 content-specific goals. And those were, number 1, students will become more aware of themselves, their likes, dislikes, strengths, hopes, and dreams. A second content goal was students will learn to set goals for themselves, both personal and academic goals. A third content goal was students will regularly monitor how they're doing with regards to their goals. A fourth one was students will experience vicarious situations where others have learned strategies to cope with obstacles in order to achieve their goals. And the last goal that we agreed on around this unit was students will demonstrate problem-solving strategies to overcome their own difficulties. So this was what we wanted students to understand about the unit as a whole and to walk away from the unit knowing. The second piece, which was content specific depending on the teacher and the subject area that the teacher taught, was evaluation activities. So what I had to do as a reading and language arts teacher was to come up with evaluation activities that would show me that students understood the content. The math teacher did the same thing, the science teacher did the same thing, the social studies teacher did also. So each teacher had specific evaluation activities that matched their content areas, but also tied in with the content. So, for example, under my reading and language arts evaluation activities, the very first thing I had students do was students will take the Gates reading test, find out their results, and write a reaction that analyzed their area of strength and weakness, focused on what past history led them to these results, and imagined means to overcome their obstacles. The second activity that I had students do, students will interview 3 adults or high school students about their goals and accomplishments and how they overcame any obstacles. Another activity, students will create a coat of arms that describes pictorially their personal and academic goals as well as their own strengths and weaknesses. Students also set personal goals for themselves in the area of reading and language arts and recorded this goal in their own Power Book, which is a homework assignment book, and they reviewed weekly how close they were to achieving their goals. They participated in hands-on activities that were designed to determine their own personal reaction to dealing with frustration and obstacles. Students created their own anthologies, which were collections of short stories, novels, and poems to reflect themselves, their goals, and their hopes and dreams. Students had a choice of a list of project options for a final project that demonstrated what they had learned about themselves in the unit. And lastly, since this was an interdisciplinary unit, we decided to have a culminating activity, which was that students would display their work in a share fair for students from other teams as well as their parents. So we had a large culminating activity, which was the share fair at the end of the unit, where students from other teams and parents were invited to come in and view each student's little booth with all of their activities and products that they had made around this unit. The third stage of webbing for unit design involves articulating the skills involved in the unit. Since this is an unusual unit, goal setting, getting what you want, isn't your typical 7th or 8th grade unit that one would study in school. What we had to do is we had to break down the evaluation activities into their skills. So, for example, the first evaluation activity was that students would take the Gates reading test, find out the results, and write a reaction. So what we did is we broke that activity down into skills. Obviously, test taking was a skill that kids would need to know and that we would have to cover, and also summarizing in a written format both oral and print information. Some other skills as we went through the evaluation activities, some other skills were all the elements of process writing for the following forms: expository writing, critical essay and interview, creative writing, both short stories and poems, reading for comprehension, organizational skills in the way of note-taking and notebook organization, listening skills, as well as interpersonal skills, those being group work and conducting an interview. The fourth stage of webbing for unit design involved making a list of your materials and resources that you would need. Ideally, you're going to be using multi-text, multi-leveled text resources in the classroom. For this unit, I used paperbacks as well as the classroom library. I had magazines. I had the materials for the hands-on activities, which involved mirrors and clothespins. We had to invite in community members and high school members for the interviewing, and audio-visual media equipment for students to make their own projects at the end of for the end of the unit. The last step is the framing questions, setting up framing questions or provocative questions. So the ones that I came up with were: number 1, is goal setting important for junior high students? Number 2, what is an important goal and what is a non-important goal? And number 3, should your goals change often? Students can add to these framing questions at the beginning of the unit and students can articulate what it is that they want to get out of the unit. Hopefully, throughout the unit, you're referring back to these framing questions so that by the end of the unit, students can answer these questions themselves. Now, how does this relate to heterogeneous instruction? Well, if you take a look at the content that was identified in this particular unit, you can see that these particular content goals can be achieved by all students, no matter what their ability. Whether they're high achievers or low achievers, whether they're high readers or low readers, it doesn't matter. Any student can certainly understand these content goals. The other thing that's nice when you take a look at the evaluation activities, that there's a range of complexity around each particular activity. If we take a look at number 1, students will take the Gates reading test and analyze their results. Any student can do that. The one area that will be different amongst students in a heterogeneous classroom is how involved they get in their own analysis. But every single student can take a look at their results and say what they thought of those results, what were their strengths and weaknesses, and why do they think that they came up with those results. So a unit like this can apply to any student. It doesn't matter what their ability or what their background knowledge is. All students can be successful in this particular goal-setting unit. And that is why webbing for unit design, knowing specifically what it is that you want students to learn by the end of the unit, that's why this is so important. One of the most difficult aspects of teaching in a heterogeneous setting is designing a grading system that is fair to all levels of students. First, it is critical to keep 3 things in mind when designing your grading strategy. Number 1, did the learner meet the baseline goals that you set for the class? Number 2, did the learner demonstrate growth in understanding and application? And number 3, does the way that you evaluate students take into consideration individual constraints, things like reading levels, levels of cognitive development, etc.? Some important questions to ask yourself when looking over your grading policy as it now stands is, number 1, if a large number of students receive F and Ds in your class, what does this tell you as a teacher? Number 2, to what extent do you make your grading policy clear to students? Number 3, how often do you work with students to have them actively monitor their own grades on a regular basis, monitor how well they're doing? And lastly, how often do you work with students to have them actively monitor you as a teacher and give you feedback on the clarity of your expectations? When you think about all of those different aspects of your grading policy, I'd like you to consider the suggestion that I have around grading. I think it's very important to make your grading policy multifaceted. In other words, make your grading policy reflect 3 different elements. One element that I'd like you to consider is one that is regularly given to students already, and that is the piece of no choice. The teacher decides which activities will lead to a grade, and the students have no input. This is pretty traditional, and it should be very familiar to you. A second element that I would like you to consider when looking at your grading policy is the idea of some choice, where students would choose from a menu of activities the projects and work that would contribute to their grade. And lastly, the last element, which is perhaps the most radical, is that of free choice, where students generate, entirely based on their own interests and strengths, projects that will demonstrate their understanding of the topic. Students will need to justify to you, the teacher, that their project choice clearly shows you and others that they have learned the content that was expected. One very important question to ask yourself is, what is the balance of choice in your overall grading policy or unit policy as it now stands? As a reading and language arts teacher, I'm responsible for giving students grades in both reading and language arts, and therefore I try to make my grading policy reflect the ideas of no choice, some choice, and free choice. Therefore, my overall goal with both of my classes is to have students, number one, increase their involvement, appreciation, fluency, and understanding of the content. Number two, demonstrate successful organizational and study skills. Number three, work cooperatively with their peers. And number four, develop a sense of responsibility and initiative for their own learning. So, when I think about my reading grade, I try to structure some no choice, free choice, some choice activities that will allow students to meet these goals. Therefore, 1/3 of my reading grade is designed as book contract. And what the book contract is individual number of pages that each student will read and do projects on with regard to outside reading. These are books that we do not read in class. These are free reading books that students choose, provided that they're not movie books, books of short stories, or books without plot. So students can choose any sort of a project that they want to in order to get credit towards their book contract, provided that the project shows me that they read and understood the whole book. That is 1/3 of the reading grade, and that is what I consider to be a free choice. A second third of the reading grade is the notebook grade. I assigned students to keep a 3-ring binder, and that 3-ring binder has 3 different sections in it. The first section is in-class notes, the second section is graded papers, and the third section is ungraded papers. Notebook checks occur every 3 weeks, and students are required to keep all of their papers and notes from reading and language arts class in this notebook. This is a no-choice section of the grade, and it's worth 1/3 of the overall reading grade. Now, the last section of the reading grade is what I consider to be a some choice, and that is tests, homeworks, and projects. The reason I consider this to be some choice is that with each thematic unit, students are given some choice from a menu of options, books that they're going to read and study, and projects that they're going to do with regards to the book and the unit around the theme. So students have some choice about the activities and books and reading levels that they're going to engage in with regards to this particular unit. Therefore, my overall reading grade is made up, I feel, equally of the free choice, some choice, and no choice options for students. Now, the student's language arts grade or writing grade is also divided into the free choice, some choice, no choice options. 3/4 of the language arts grade are the students' writing projects. I assign 10 writing projects a marking period. We have a 13-week trimester as our marking period in our school. So students have to do 10 pieces of writing each marking period. Writing projects are graded either as a P, which means it is a polished draft, or U, which means it is an unpolished draft, or 0, which means it was never handed in. Work that is handed in past the deadlines automatically earns a U. And a P is worth 10 points and a U is worth 5 points. And U's can always be upgraded if the student wants to take the time to do so. Topics for the writing class usually are approximately 60% chosen from a menu that the teacher provides and about 40% chosen entirely by student choice. So I consider the writing projects to be a mix of some choice and free choice. The last quarter of the grade is spelling, and this is considered no choice. Students work on their own individualized spelling lists, which are taken from graded lists and their own writing. Spelling folders are checked regularly for process and organization, and that is how students get a grade around their spelling. We don't take spelling tests. Instead, I take a look at how the students are progressing on the mastery of their spelling lists. And that is considered a no-choice aspect of their language arts grade. When I designed my grading policy, it was important for me, again, to think in terms of, did the learner meet the baseline goals that I set for the class? Did the learner demonstrate growth in understanding and application? And did the way that I evaluate students take into consideration individual constraints?
You need to teach to individuals, not just to a classroom as a whole. And so I think the theory is very valid. I think you need to get away, for social studies, for example, I think you need to get away from the textbook as your sole source of information. I think you need to get materials on the same subject, on different reading levels. So
one of the things that I have to do, as Kathy brought up in evaluating, is to allow individuals to express their knowledge in various ways. It may be an oral presentation in front of a class. It may be something that they write. It might be a collage. It may be a discussion, panel discussion by two or three individuals. And it allows the knowledge to come out, but it allows the individual who might be good at one thing to express it that way.
I think you need to have a different mix of activities that teach to, or bring out children's strengths. Different kinds of projects. Even as adults, some of us are more verbal, some are more comfortable in writing, some are more comfortable with hands-on projects, and I think the kids in our classrooms mirror those same kinds of abilities.
What I've had to come around to doing is coming up with an estimate of a person's ability, taking a look at what they do and comparing the two.
There's so many ways to get an A in here. If you don't get an A one way, you can get it another way. If you fail at one thing, you can try another thing. It's totally, it's like the saying, if at first you don't succeed, try again. In here, if you don't get it right the first time, keep trying, because one of these days you'll get it.
The nice thing is you can chart your progress. There's a chart back there that has all 10 writing assignments, and it says P or U. So you can look straight across the board and say P. If they're all P's, you know what your grade's going to be. It's no surprise the day that you get your report card.
And that's really hard when you have a teacher that is so not involved with you, the student, that at the end of the year you don't know if you're getting an F or an A.
It's really good the way you can redo things, because some people, like, I've done this before, like I thought I did a good job, but I made a few mechanical errors that really added up in my grade. So, and I went back and I redid them, and it wasn't hard at all, but it really made a big improvement on my grade.
I like to challenge myself because I used to like to. Last year I chose some really easy books because I thought that I could just whiz right through them, but this year I'm trying to challenge myself a little bit more.
Why?
I don't know, we had a big unit on goal setting, and I kind of set a personal goal to do better in my grades and stuff by challenging myself to do harder things.
No, you're competing against yourself, what your goal is.
This helps you because you can realize your potential and you can figure out your reading level and if you need to improve or not.
It's good that everyone has a chance to really improve themselves, and no matter what their level of abilities are.
Heterogeneous grouping means several things. Number one, it means that you group and regroup students often depending upon the task at hand with a clear rationale and purpose. It also means providing access to the content at different reading and cognitive levels. It means using combinations of mixed ability groups as well as similar ability groups. And it means giving students the opportunity to choose the levels at which they wish to work. Heterogeneous grouping does not mean that you place students in groups without a clear purpose or rationale. It does not mean that students will learn from the same book at the same rate. It also does not mean that students will have no choice about the levels at which they will work. And it doesn't mean that students will remain in static, unchanging groupings for long periods of time. Therefore, it is very, very important for you to take a look at the groups that you structure in your class. Grouping for instruction is very important. There are two legitimate forms of heterogeneous instruction. The first type involves mixed ability groups, and I like to see mixed ability groupings considered in terms of reading levels, cognitive levels, writing levels, and levels of background knowledge. Specific situations when you would use this type of grouping is when students are working with common content, when they're working on problem-solving activities, and if they're reviewing basic baseline knowledge. However, there is a second legitimate form of grouping students for heterogeneous instruction, and that includes same skill groupings. This is when you could group students who have the same spelling levels, same math skills, same organizational skills. If you're working on grammar and punctuation, mechanics, or reading and decoding skill works. There are situations when you would use this particular type of grouping, the same skill grouping, and that is when specific skill work breaks down into vastly different levels and where mastery at one skill level is a requisite for moving on to another skill level. In my classes, I structure groups, and I do about 90% of all decision-making when it comes to which students are going to be working in which groups. I only allow students to self-select their groups approximately 10% of the time. It's very important to keep an eye out for the purpose of the groups, number one, and the makeup of the groups, number two. Now, the second type of grouping for instruction is not an example of tracking, and there are several reasons for that. Number one, all students need skill work at some point. For example, a high-level reader might be a terrible speller. So you're going to have flexible groupings around these various skills. Number two, content is not simply skill work. That is why if you do temporary flexible groups in terms of same skill groupings, students are going to be working on skills that apply to an overall context or content. Keep in mind that content is not simply skill work. And lastly, no matter what grouping in terms of same skill grouping I use in my classroom, students always have the opportunity to work at a higher level if they so choose, provided that they have mastered the skills that they need to at their level. So for example, when I work in terms of spelling, I have 4 different levels of spelling work that students do. Students always have the opportunity, if they're on the first base low-level spelling, they can practice and work at the second base level if they want to, but they're still responsible for mastery of the first base spelling list. I personally use same skill groupings on Thursdays and Fridays in my class. Thursdays and Fridays are days that are set aside for skill and drill work, such as spelling work in my content area, since I'm a reading and language arts teacher. I do my mini lessons around grammar and punctuation, mechanics of writing, and I have students in same skill groups on Thursdays and Fridays working on the particular skills that they need to. These groups will change once a student has mastered a particular concept, then they'll move on to a different group.
The math teachers in the junior high have tried to separate 2 different areas, skills and problem solving. And the skills, we have still worked on some homogeneous grouping because they're so sequential. We've been taking some of the students and cross-teaming them to try to meet their skill needs. But we feel that problem solving is really very good at a good area to do heterogeneous grouping, and we've been working on that too. There are kids that are very low in skills that are excellent problem solvers, and they shine in that area, and then you see them, I mean, they just feel so fantastic when they are the leader of the group, and very often they are, because they have some skills that you never see in the math skills areas, and that's why it's important to separate them. If these students were in a totally tracked system, you wouldn't see this sort of this shining light that they have in problem solving. You'd never find it. A lot of times, if it was totally tracked, they would become depressed or really upset. They'd have a math phobia. And at least this way, they see that they can be successful in certain areas of math, and in the skill areas, they are getting the help they need.
Well, I've had an opportunity now to collect data over nearly 20 years of teaching, and I think the thing that is dramatic for me is the changes that I see in students who have severe learning disabilities or significant learning impairments, if they are included in the mainstream and are through these heterogeneous settings. I think typically it's real fair to say that when students were tracked or grouped in a resource room setting, there would be sort of a composite of all kinds of kids that are frustrated with learning. There's an awful lot that goes into making it successful for all students. But myself, I can say honestly that the differences that I see for kids are pretty dramatic. I think that there is still a place, and I believe this, for some students to have the need to be in a more homogeneous setting if in fact they've got a very dramatic need for a specific type of program, if they're years and years behind their peers in terms of their academic levels. But I see that as short term. I think it's important to say that at the end of this, the goal is to be included in the mainstream. I think it's a real important piece of it for the child, that there may be a need for some individual work in a specific area so that the success in the regular class will be ensured.
Usually we're in small groups, and they're like all the kids vary in their skill. Like, I'm a very good reader, I guess. Well, everybody thinks I am, like all the teachers, and I don't really let it on. So I'm reading like a college book right now, and it's like 400 pages, and like other kids are like really good writers, but they can't read as well. So I help them out, and they help me out.
Is this setup helping your spelling skills?
Yeah, because like I can practice on my level, and then if I get better on my level, I just keep going up, and I can stay there until I get better on the next level, and it works.
So have you noticed your spelling improving a lot?
Yeah. I like the fact that I'm encouraged by other students to keep going and get my grades up.
So those two things is what those three things actually are what I'm looking for today for brownie points, but especially volume control. Okay, so just have a volume monitor. Since appropriate heterogeneous instruction relies to a great extent on cooperative learning and group activities, it's extremely important for a teacher to have set up in the classroom effective classroom management techniques. Typically in my classroom, I spend approximately 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of class giving a teacher-directed lesson, and the remainder of the class is spent with students working in groups. Therefore, I had to devise some sort of a system where students would not only attend to me when I was talking and giving specific directed instruction, but I also didn't want them to be off task when they were working in their groups. So I devised two systems, which I entitle a carrot and a stick approach. The first is the stick approach, and that is called Barwin Deadly Points. And what I've done is I've outlined classroom rules which entail simply not interrupting, being on time to class, causing no distractions, making sure that students are considerate with one another, no put-downs, etc. and always make sure you've done your homework. Those basic tenets of the classroom rules are enforced with a point system. And what I do is I give students a point every time they break a rule or have some sort of an infraction, and after 3 points, they stay after school. When they're after school for a detention or an after-school session, what we do is the student and I sit down and we talk about what it is that caused that student to have a detention and what it is specifically that the student can do differently in terms of their behavior in order to avoid getting a detention for a second time or another time. And this works really well. It's not simply a punitive type of classroom management system, but it also involves talking with students and problem solving. So that is the stick approach to classroom management. It's the Barwin deadly points, where after 3 points you stay after school. The carrot, which I think is equally important, the incentive for students to behave and to work well in groups, involves what I call the brownie point system. And brownie points are for effective group work. If everybody in a group can work effectively and perform the specific tasks that I'm asking students to do within a class setting, then everybody in the group will earn a brownie point. And for me, I tabulate brownie points by simply marking them on a poster with stinky stickers. Next to a student's name, if they've earned a brownie point, one stinky sticker goes next to their name. And for every sticker or every brownie point that a student earns, that's a point added to their final grade. So students have an incentive to work well in groups and to do specific group social skills that I ask them to do. For example, volume control, focusing on the teacher or whichever student happens to have the floor, task completion, staying on task, moving from one task to another. Those are particular types of things that I tell the class at the beginning of class that I'm going to be looking for students to earn a brownie point. And if everybody in the group can do it, then everybody in the group gets a brownie point. Number 1, brownie points, if you're interested. Number 1 is volume control. Since so many groups are working so hard on getting their summaries done, the volume's going to be high. That's number 1. And number 2, the other thing I'm looking for is actually 3 things. I feel like I shouldn't even have to say focus anymore. But the third thing is transition. Because once your group is finished, and I know already 2 groups are going to finish early today, you're going to transition on to doing what when your group is finished? SSR. Yeah. Okay. So those 2 things is what those 3 things actually are what I'm looking for today for brownie points, but especially volume control. And I have 1 group so far that's doing excellent volume control. Okay. So just have a volume monitor. Pick somebody to make sure to encourage quiet voices. Go ahead and keep going so you use up the time. One measure of this system's effectiveness is how the kids view the system and whether or not it works.
You'll get points for not doing your homework, put downs, or being disruptive. And if you get 3 points, you get a detention, an after-school detention.
Well, the brownie point system is pretty good. We all sit in groups around the room, and when Mrs. Barwin says focus, if we all look at her and pay attention to her, then we get a brownie point. I like the idea of brownie points.
I definitely like the idea of brownie points.
Because if you do really bad on a test or something, you can use the brownie points to bring your test grade up.
So make sure you get them because the final drafts are due tomorrow. That's number 1, brownie points for focusing, transitioning, and more importantly, volume control, which was really hard today. Adrian's group, Adrian by herself, obviously. Kelsey's group got brownie points, and Sue's group got brownie points. Finally, I'm going to talk to you about the use of study skills within the content areas in order to help students succeed in a heterogeneous setting. Study skills, by definition, are skills that are important to have in order to succeed in the classroom. They're skills that we often assume students will develop by themselves with little guidance or no guidance from us, and they're also skills that apply across all content areas. There are several faulty assumptions about study skills that circulate out in the educational arena. First of all, a faulty assumption is that the teaching of these skills, the presentation, development, and review of these skills is a curriculum unto itself. It shouldn't be separate. It should be embedded in the curriculum as you teach it. Secondly, another faulty assumption is that study skills should only be taught in one particular content area, such as English class. And another faulty assumption that often I hear is that most kids are already familiar with study skills and therefore teachers really don't need to worry about them. When in fact, study skills and reading in the content area skills are simply fancy names for teaching strategies. I consider study skills to be a type of a teaching methodology. These are methods that will help your students learn more about what you're trying to teach them. And if you model these strategies as methodologies, the students will hopefully internalize these skills as well. I also feel that these methods, teaching of study skills, can be easily incorporated into any lesson or unit that you teach, no matter what your content area. And finally, I feel that the more exposure to these skills that students receive, the better the student becomes at incorporating these skills into his or her own daily practice, being able to eventually use them without guidance. The study skills that I'm going to be talking with you about and modeling for you are advanced organizers, note-taking, self-evaluation, time management, and test-taking strategies. The first study skill that I'm going to talk about is one that I call an advanced organizer. A definition of an advanced organizer simply means that you have demonstrated the purpose of the lesson, demonstrated the relevance of it to the knowledge that students already have. Some questions to ask yourselves in order to double check whether or not you do this is it clear what the students are supposed to know by the end of the unit? Are performance expectations clear? And is there relevance to the lesson? Does it relate to something that came before? And will it relate to something coming later? To me, that is an advanced organizer, and it takes the form of a unit overview.
The system is a unit overview, and it tells you the purpose of the unit and all the major elements that's going to be in the unit. And it tells you each of the tests and when the tests are going to be and each projects that you have to do, so you know that ahead of the time, you know, what work you're going to have to put into it. It's really helpful because when you read it over, you know exactly what's going to happen. And that way, like, if you think that you're going to get behind, you can read ahead, or you can do things that, if you think that in other classes you're going to have too much homework or something, you can do something before it because you know what's going to be expected. This is really good because you know exactly what you're going to do.
A second study skill is note-taking. Definition in my mind for note-taking is a standard or consistent method by which students organize information. Some questions and double checks for you are to ask yourself, are my students successful at taking notes? Do I model clear note-taking methods to them? Do my students have the same note-taking expectations and strategies in each class throughout the day? And is there a progression throughout the grades of note-taking expectations and abilities? Each content area teacher in our school is committed to counting notebooks as a part of each overall grade. This helps students take note-taking and notebook organization very seriously. The particular note-taking system that our school adopted is the Cornell method of note-taking. All teachers in the school use this particular note-taking system not only when they give notes to students, but also when they ask students to take notes either on written material or on classroom discussion. The Cornell note-taking method is a simple method, and it easily adapts itself for use as a study guide. It involves putting the main idea on the left-hand side of a 3-inch margin and the details that accompany the main idea over on the right-hand side.
Our notebooks are organized into 3 different groups. You can see it. Notes, ungraded papers, and graded papers. And in our notes, we just put our notes that she takes up on the board. And in ungraded papers, we put in anything that doesn't have a grade on it. And in graded papers, we put in anything that does have a grade on it, except for our language arts papers, which we put in our cubbies because they're part of our portfolios.
A third study skill that I employ in my classroom is the technique of self-evaluation or self-assessment. This is the ability for students to use self-reflection to accurately determine their areas of strengths and weakness. Double checks for myself include: do students monitor their progress in class? Are students aware of what they must do to succeed? Can students accurately assess their progress? Do they have regular opportunities to bounce their impressions off of you? And can students determine in which areas they need to improve? A fourth study skill is time management. The definition for time management is that students are able to understand time, both long spans and short spans of time, in order to accomplish tasks. Double checks for myself include asking myself, do I work with students to estimate the time it will take to perform certain tasks, not only short-term tasks, but long-term tasks as well? And do I present schedules and calendars to students to help them keep track of their deadlines?
Finish the summaries and
read
Act 2.
up to,
Act,
no, not all of them.
all of Act 2. It's
Yeah.
not that long. It's just
not-
about
it's
as long
20
as this
pages.
one.
Yeah, I know, but, okay.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Is that okay with you, Brian?
Before we get started with our real lesson today on verbs, what I would like to do is just make sure that every group is aware of what they have for homework. Okay? Now, I just want to close off the status of the class. I had that Lynette's group, which was just Lynette and Ethan. You guys were going to work on the summarizing of Act 1. Ethan, did you finish that?
I'm almost finished.
So you guys are going to finish that tomorrow, or
Right.
do it for
And
homework?
no, we'll do it tomorrow, and we'll also do Act 2.
Okay.
Because we'll have more people and we'll go fast.
So what is your group's homework tonight?
Ours? Read all of Act 2.
Okay, read all of Act 2. A fifth and last study skill that I model in my classes and set time aside for in my classes is the study skill of test taking. The definition of test taking strategies for me means, do students understand how and what to study in order to take a test? Double checks for me, I ask myself, do I review with students how to determine what is necessary to study? Do I give students practice in class, working with each other, reviewing for a test? Do I explain methods to take the test? For example, is it a time test? Are there specific methods that will help them, such as answering the questions that you know first, then going back and doing the ones that you're not sure about, etc.?
Here. Their house. There.
In conclusion, it's important to reiterate that study skills are skills that teachers model for their students, and they use their content area as vehicles to teach the study skills. It is not an added curriculum. It is not an add-on to the content that you're already teaching. It's teaching methodology. And if you incorporate study skills into your heterogeneous classroom, students will experience success. After viewing this video, you may feel overwhelmed and wonder how you can change everything you're currently doing to fit this model. Obviously, you won't be able to change everything overnight. Be realistic and take it one step at a time. My advice to you would be to pick one unit that you currently teach that you really enjoy. A longer unit rather than a shorter unit would be best. I would also suggest that you work with another teacher in order to brainstorm ideas together. It's not a bad idea, believe it or not, to even approach the administration for some summer curriculum time or release time to work on this pilot unit. After all, if the administration expects teachers to make the radical change of moving from a tracked setting to a non-tracked setting, the administration should support the background work that is necessary. Expect that transition to last a few years. Believe me, the gains will be worth the work. You'll notice an increase in student learning and positive attitudes, parents will be supportive, and you will go home happy. I know because I've been in your shoes. Good luck.
I cannot be a partner.